Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
Today we're talking about Shelia Bair's book, Bull by the Horns, and really the essence of the story is in the subtitle of the book, which is Fighting to Save Main Street from Wall Street and Wall Street from Itself. And that if you don't read anything else in the book, that will tell you everything that she's going to go into. And as a former financial regulator, and I'll get into more of my background in a minute, I know exactly what she's talking about. And as Joe said, it's something that everyone should read. This book is a book everyone should read, because not only does she herself lament about the lack of financial education of our populace, but it also, I think, will explode a lot of myths that people have been served up with respect to how we got into the mess in 2000 and the myths surrounding some of the things that have been done to get us out of the mess of 2007, 2008. And she does this from a first-hand perspective. And she puts it in a form that makes it part textbook for an MBA class, but don't let that scare you. There are plenty of villains in this book. There are plenty of stories that you would not believe and leave you scratching your head about how people, smart people, in high places can do some of the things that they've done, and you'll come away with, half an MBA degree squared away, and the other half you will have read your latest mystery, crime mystery about what actually went down in our financial markets over the last 5 years. And she updates this. And one of the nice things about this is that she has updated it in an epilogue that was written just this past July. So it's present. So it's not just a historical account. You kind of take the historical into perspective, and then you say, okay, it's all very interesting. But she really brings it up to the present day, and that's critical for any book because, well, we're still living in it. We're still living in the outcomes, the fallout from the recession, from the bailout. Some of you will look at your stock reports and you'll see that you're still dealing with the fallout from the recession. You'll be thinking, I wanted to retire a couple of years ago, but I haven't, or I shouldn't have retired a few years ago when I did, because the economy is still very, very fragile. And it's not by any means to give a sense that it's all doom and gloom and that there is nothing to be hopeful for, because ultimately a very hopeful message that things like these occurrences over the last 5 years put into books like Bull by the Horns will give you a sense that with the right amount of energy, education, and concern, we can actually get through some of these things and then deal with them the way we need to deal with them. Does she have a difference of opinion from others in Washington as to how some of these things should be done? The answer is yes, of course, and that's what gives you the good premise for a book. But she also says that even with those disagreements, there is hope that we can avoid these types of things in the future. And that's, you have to read all the way through it. Because, the funny thing is, you read the prologue and you read the epilogue, you can get about 90% of the story. But there you also get what went wrong, but also why you should be hopeful, just in those two parts. But then she fills in, from those bookends of the book, she fills in lots of stories. Some of them a little dense, some of them a little technical, because we're talking about bailouts, we're talking about mortgages, we're talking about the subprime crisis, we're talking about the General Motors bailout, we're talking about resolution, and we'll get back to that word in a few minutes as well. And it can be a little bit a little bit thick to kind of go through, from time to time. But when you simply think that this is about your money, you're willing to go through that. You're willing to slog through those denser parts of the book, because this book is a book about all of us. This is a book about us, not about Wall Street, not about the policymakers in Washington. This is about all of us who check our accounts, who thought we had value, who put our trust in other people. And so that will get you through this book. It will, because this is a book about us. Now, a couple of things. Just my background. I am the product of an immigrant father who came here during the Depression and a mother whose family never really had financial issues. So that's number one. Number two, I'm a former financial regulator. I was the superintendent of insurance, as they called us back in the day, here in New York from 2001 to 2005. And I was with the insurance department before I became the Department of Financial Services last year. I was at the department for 10 years. And I was with the New York Senate prior to that doing insurance legislative work. So I've been involved in the insurance area for a long time. While insurance is only touched upon in this book, I'm going to come back to a couple of vignettes that I've had in my own personal experience to kind of reinforce some of the messages that Shelia gives in her book. And I got through my 10 years as a regulator and my time in government, never forgetting that I was the product of an immigrant father who came here just prior to the Depression, whose family had virtually no money. And a mother who came from a small family. They weren't rich by any means, but as my father would used to measure it, that my mother's father, my grandfather, had a bookie. Back in the day, you had a bookie when you were in New York City, and elsewhere as well, I am assuming. But if you had a bookie, that means you had money. My father's father, my paternal grandfather, didn't have a bookie because they didn't have anything to bet with. So the fact is that those are the things that colored my experiences as a financial regulator. I was the superintendent of insurance appointed and elevated from my job as first deputy superintendent to superintendent of insurance by Governor Pataki in May of 2001. So I had a blissful 4 months as superintendent, and then one morning driving to New York City, experienced what all of us experienced far and near, and that was, of course, 9/11. And 9/11 changed the world for all of us, again, just like the recession did in 2008. It changed our world forever, that on a geopolitical basis and on an economic basis to some degree. But in 2007, 2008, the global recession changed our worlds as we know them on a financial and also on a geopolitical basis as well. But it was during 9/11, the aftermath of 9/11, that I got to meet Shelia Bair. The author of our book today was an assistant secretary of the Treasury. And she was head of financial markets. And so after 9/11, when the Treasury folks first came to New York City, and they said, okay, how much is this going to cost? And we told the folks from Justice and from Treasury that, well, your exposure is about 10.5 million people. Let's start with that, and then we can figure out how much it's going to cost. They all walked out basically ashen as the rest of us were walking out of Lower Manhattan that day, and I did that with soot all over me and all the folks from the insurance department. But it was then that we knew that we had to get tough about how we regulate. You know, if you really want to know when the regulator's job really gets hard, it's when one of those types of events occurs. And she goes into that to some degree in the financial crisis, but I couldn't help but think back to my time at 9/11 and my time with Shelia in her office at the Treasury Department with other insurance regulators and other bankers and folks from the Federal Reserve Board down in Washington and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and others as we tried to work through a crisis. Now, if I had to juxtapose the two of them, I would say that 9/11 was unrehearsed, unannounced, unexpected, and unplanned for. So to a certain extent, we had a certain amount of patience from the public, from all of you, because we were making it up as we went along. And I don't mean that we didn't know what we were doing, but there had been no script on how do you deal with a 9/11. There is a script, though, for a thing like a financial crisis, because we've been through those before. If you remember, and I get back to this word resolution, if you remember the Resolution Trust Corporation, going back to the savings and loans debacle of the 1980s, that was a financial crisis that we dealt with by taking these weak and damaged banks in, fixing those that could be fixed, and then running off those that could not be fixed. And that becomes a very interesting thing for us to think about, because 9/11, when we're dealing with Shelia Bair, she had been a former counsel to Senator Bob Dole from Kansas and had lived through these same types of events. So while 9/11, we had to kind of figure it out and make it up as we went along to some degree, she was able to color her own experience on how we should handle the financial crisis by what we had all learned from the S&L crisis, from the Depression back in the 30s, and other things like that. But she and I did have an opportunity to meet on a number of occasions during the aftermath of 9/11. How do you come up with, basically, and it's a similar situation to what happened in the financial crisis, how do you come up with a couple of $billion, a couple of $1 trillion on the fly? And how do you stabilize your marketplace? And then how do you avoid making matters worse? And that's what she goes into in great detail in the book. And she has, in her perspective, when it comes to 2008 through 2012, she had a very different approach to dealing with these issues than some of the other people around her in Washington. And you get a great sense, number one, there's some hope that you do have people who are thinking about Main Street. And there's nobody more Main Street, if you will, than Shelia Bair. You know, she probably, you know, and I don't mean this in any kind of a, you know, condescending way, but, you know, a girl from Kansas, she probably had to click her heels 3 times and say there's no place like home sometimes, because, you know, it was, she had to utter once or twice, Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore, when she had to deal with some of the people that she dealt with in some of the situations as the chairwoman of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. But the thing that strikes me about the book, and the detail that she goes into, is how we have dealt with these things before, but we manage to sometimes make the same mistakes all over again. Now, she talks about this notion of resolution, about taking some of these banks in, and you know the names, Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, Chase Manhattan, Wachovia, Washington Mutual, WAMU, as a lot of people knew it as, and do you bail them out, or do you take them into resolution? Now, the resolution, as we've come to know that, means taking them in, managing the impairment, as we call it, or the insolvency, selling it off, and running it off. And she was just absolutely opposed to the notion of bailing out without some kind of remedial activity taking place to fix these entities. So whether it's TARP, which is, by the way, done under the Republican administration with a mix of Democrats and Republicans in the mix, or stimulus, other bailouts, General Motors bailout, things like that were done largely in a Democratic administration, but again with Democrats and Republicans doing this, and all of this being underpinned by a housing crisis and a housing policy that had been promoted by both Democrats and Republicans. So Shelia finds herself in an odd spot, being a Republican, appointed by a Republican president, now working largely in a Democratic administration, but where there was no partisan safe haven, because everybody was involved with this. Everybody was. From Clinton to Bush to Obama on housing policy, from Bush to Obama on TARP, stimulus, bailouts. There was none of the usual safe havens, partisan safe havens to go to, like, okay, the Republicans always think this way, so I'm going to park myself with the Republicans, or the Democrats always think this way, so I'm going to park myself with the Democrats. Here's a Republican who's largely out on her own, because there was no partisan safe haven, because they were all involved in this decision-making. She names names in this book and says, look, this Democratic senator from New York said, yes, we need to give relief to the Wall Street banks. You have this Democratic congressman who says, no, we've gone too far. We need to pull back. And then you have this other person or this other administration official saying, no, we need to do whatever. It defied the conventional wisdom of what we know of Republicans and Democrats. A lot of people think Republicans are law and order types, but when it comes to street crime, but not so law and order when it comes to Wall Street. You know, laissez-faire, give them their break, give them the relief from capital, all that sort of stuff. And then you think that Democrats are largely laissez-faire on street crime, but want to be tough on the fat cats. None of that makes sense, because none of it is as it appears. And while she doesn't go after that affirmative partisan analysis, that's what comes out of this book, is that you say they're all in this. And it's not meant to say, well, none of them can be trusted, but they all really thought they were doing the right thing. But she's looking at herself saying, wait a second, I may be the only voice of Main Street here in Washington. And apparently she was. And Main Street means a lot more than just having a small business. It means all of us who have any kind of investment account, from a stock account to a CD to a savings account. And that's why the subtitle of her book is so important. It really distinguishes what's going on, and does Wall Street have too much clout? Now, to all of us down here on Main Street, your visceral answer would be yes, of course. Okay, and that's what politicians appeal to. And they tell us we're going to go after these guys. But the fact is, not everybody goes after those guys, because they also know that this world is built upon some of that stuff. And sophisticated financials are part of the realities of global living in the 21st century. But how do you strike that balance? It's not so much saving Main Street from Wall Street, or saving Wall Street from itself. Definitely Wall Street saving it from itself. But how do you strike the right balance between the two? And she goes to try and talk about that through things like doing resolutions rather than bailouts, rectifying situations, not merely addressing them, by challenging the status quo. And in her case, she had multiple layers of status quo that she was attacking. The only woman in the room in most of the meetings, okay? She's the head of the FDIC. The Treasury Secretary is a guy. The head of the Office of Control of the Currency is a guy. The President is a guy. The head of the Federal Reserve is a guy. And don't think that even here in the 21st century, that doesn't mean something. Okay? As the father of 2 daughters and the brother of 5 sisters, I can tell you I have to be pro-girl. And the fact is that that is still an issue, even in 2012. That's number one. Number two is the partisan. She is a Republican, but she's a Main Street Republican, not a Wall Street Republican. And the third is she is from Main Street, not from Wall Street. So she's telling her stories, and you need to remember the storytelling she's doing in those multiple contexts, that she is approaching this from these points of disadvantage, if you will. But she doesn't wear that as a burden. She doesn't say, woe is me, because she goes in and she fights twice as hard for some of the things that she really believed in. She knew she had to compromise on a number of things. She found it singularly distasteful, some of the things she ended up having to get roped into. But she is very much out there saying, yeah, this is how it went down. Good, bad, and different. Whether I was to be congratulated or vilified for that, so be it. And in fact, one of the reviewers of the book says, you know, it's great to write a book, but why didn't you do some of these things when you were in that position of authority? And that's a fair question. You can write the book, very interesting copy, but the question is, it's still out there, so why didn't you do this? Having worked in government, sometimes you know you have to throw up your hands because you just can't keep fighting and fighting and fighting. You still have to get something done. And the art of compromise, which is missing in Washington right now, is what was necessary to be on display during the financial crisis. You had to compromise. Both sides coming to some degree of the middle. And she talks about how she compromised on a number of things, but where others around her would not compromise. And then do the, you know, they say in one of the Jack Ryan movies with Harrison Ford, you know, you do the Washington two-step. Well, the thing is, she wasn't very interested in dancing, as the Harrison Ford character said as well. We're not here to do two steps. We're here to try and fix this problem. Now, in my own experience as a superintendent, I saw some of the vestiges of this, not vestiges, some of the things that led up to this problem. And she talks about in great detail, and something everybody really needs to know is how our money is regulated in the first place. Who is the Fed? Who is what they call the Office of the Controller of the Currency? Who was the Office of Thrift Supervision? Who is the insurance commissioner? Who is the banking commissioner in the states? Why do the feds regulate some things and states regulate other things? Those are all important things to know. as a state regulator of insurance, and I don't know how many of you know that insurance is not regulated at all at the federal level. Not at all. As a New York commissioner, I was one of the voices in the national regulation of insurance because we came from a big state, had a lot of insurance companies in it. But you have this bifurcation of financial regulation, and she talks about that as well. And that's not just a passing interest or a political science concept. That has very real implications for all of us. And she talks about what happens in those cases. She talks about how the folks at the Fed and the Treasury Department forgot about the insurance regulators, who are as much a part of the financial marketplace as everyone else. But something that I will bet you don't know, which is why I'm here to tell you, because if I didn't leave anything you didn't know, this really wouldn't be worth the lunch, would it? The fact is that of all the entities that ended up having trouble from 2008 to 2012, still, the only sector of financial services that did not have a precipitous decline and a calamitous outcome of the turndown in 2008 was the insurance marketplace. And this goes to the core of her message, and here's why. The insurance world is regulated by 50 state regulators. So number one, trying to change anything for the worse is hard to do. In Washington, you get three guys in a room, and they can make something bad overnight. In the insurance world, to try and do something bad, you really have to work at it. And then let's look at the flip side of that. To do good, you need to make your case, and you need to put things in place. You can also, as they call states, the labs of public policy, because this is where you try things out. You can try something in New York and not have it infect the rest of the country. If it turns out well, the other guys pick it up. If it doesn't work out well, you haven't put a contagion into the system on a national basis. That's why state policy sometimes is far more preferred by a lot of us to federal policy without there having been some kind of an experimentation or testing of these policies in the states. One of the great things about our federalist system is that you have the states to try a lot of this stuff out. But here's where it comes down to it. She says that the contagion that spread was that when we had the go-go times of the mid-2000s, we were all making a lot of money in our investment accounts, government is good, economy is fantastic, all right? They said, you know what, we want to do some capital easing. Capital easing, 2004, 2005. We think we're holding on to too much money, the banks said. I mean, the investment banks as well as the commercial banks. They go to their three regulators in Washington at the time, the Federal Reserve, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and the Office of Thrift Supervision, says, we want to ease. And with their both bipartisan support in Congress, they do exactly that. They eased the capital. And they were able to basically take that money out, pay dividends to their investors, do other things with the money, start, subprime lending, things like that. You all heard those terms. And what they did was it weakened them without them knowing how weak they were. So when bad time came, that so-called rainy day came, and it was only a year and a half away, they suddenly didn't have enough money to cover the losses. And that's what she bristles out more than anything else. As an insurance regulator, I know exactly what she's talking about. But by very definition, number one, I was a regulator. She was a regulator. Regulators are not supposed to necessarily be cheerleaders. Okay, we want to have a good, vibrant insurance marketplace in New York. Don't get me wrong. You have to buy insurance, and we want you to be able to buy it at an affordable rate. But don't buy insurance that I know they can't cover when you have a storm, like, say, Sandy just a few weeks ago. And she bristles at the idea that they squandered all that capital that would have gotten them through the recession without any problem by easing the rules of capital back in 2005 and 2006. That's where the real damage started. It started long before subprime in 2007. It started with the easing of these capital rules. Now, I worked for a Republican administration. I worked as a regulator in a Republican administration. And my view as a regulator, like Shelia Bair, was, no. You don't ease those capital rules. And I'll give you a perfect for instance of what happened in my own experience, working with Sheila. After 9/11, Lloyd's of London. You've heard of Lloyd's of London before. Big insurance market out of England. Lloyd's doesn't have the money to cover 9/11 claims. Like, wow, that's a pretty big deal. You have to call on the Bank of England, got to go other places to get that money. They had a multi-billion-dollar hit from 9/11. And they are required to keep certain reserves in the United States if we let insurance carriers use Lloyd's of London. They didn't have the money. What do? Some of my insurance colleagues said, let's lower the standards. So if we lower the standards, we'll make the standard meet whatever money they have. And we said, wait a second, you can't do that. The money is not how much they have. The question of the money is how much do they need? We are not going to use the crisis as a way to lower the standards, okay? Because it's just bad public policy. You don't just lower standards just by, like that. And sure enough, my position prevailed, and we said, okay, Lloyd's of London, you're not going to get a reduced standard for how much money you need to have on reserve in the United States. We'll give you more time to raise it, but the standard is still the standard. Now, what they could have done with all of this money that these banks had, you may have been able to say, you know what, you can do some other things with it, but we don't want you to get rid of it. And that's what Sheila's talking about throughout the book is if they only had the money. But no, they wanted to get more investors. We're going to pay bigger dividends and more dividends and do things like that. Problem is, the money wasn't there when they needed it. Sure enough, in my 9/11 example, the money came in. The money was there when we needed it to be there, and that worked. But we resisted the temptation on the part of my fellow regulators to reduce the standard. And that's what you need to have. Look, whether you're talking about banks or investment banks or insurance companies, there's got to be a certain amount of money in there at all times, whether you like it or not. Because bad things happen on a daily basis when you least expect them. Yes?
What would have been the rollout if you had reduced the standard after 9/11? If you had followed...
Okay. On the question is, what would have happened if we had reduced the standards? Okay. If we had reduced the standards, now you remember, right after 9/11, we went into a mini recession. And insurance works somewhat countercyclical to the economic cycles, but still, if we had reduced the standards, number one, you should never reduce standards during a crisis anyway, because you don't have the fullness of thought and clear view of whether that standard should in fact be reduced on principle. But the other part of it was that we would have then allowed, if we had reduced the standard, Lloyd's to start writing even more business. When we didn't, that wasn't necessarily our objective. Our objective was making sure they could pay the claims that they had. And I think that if we had reduced the standard, we would have, A, been accused of using a crisis as an opportunity, not in a favorable way, number one. Number two, we probably would never have gone back to revisit that standard. Because raising a standard, always much harder than bringing a standard down. And the likelihood is that we would never have gotten the standard back up again. Now, some of the standards did change over the years, but never so much that the insurance industry found itself in crisis. As I said before, the insurance industry, because of the way they do their accounting, because of it being a state-regulated industry, and because by nature, insurance regulators are far more conservative, there was plenty of money for the insurance industry still, 5 years later, to handle lower interest rates, and insurance is totally interest rate sensitive, to handle claims from a thing like a Sandy and other natural disasters. The insurance industry never went through the significant dysfunction. You didn't see an insurance company go down like Bear Stearns or like Lehman Brothers or the others, because there's a fundamentally different philosophy about regulating them, and Sheila has much more of that regulatory philosophy than the philosophy of the people around her. Sir?
How do standards play into, not the insurance agency, but a federal government who continues, it seems without end, to print money? What kind of standards are being applied there?
Well, that's exactly that's the question she asks. She asks that question over and over again because there doesn't seem to be a standard when you have somebody who has the keys to the printing press. That's why she bristles on the notion of using bailouts as much. And the problem with bailouts are very easy to do, relatively speaking. as long as you have the printing press. Because you can commit all this money. But what really changed in AIG? What really changed in General Motors? And on top of that, and that's what she was asking, resolution meant going in and fixing what it was. The other part of the bailout, and this is my question, not hers, but what about the notion of fundamental fairness when you have Ford Motor Company having made all those hard decisions back in 05 and 06? By the way, they weren't paying higher dividends. They were mortgaging all of their factories so that they could stay alive. And suddenly the government comes in, bails out General Motors and Chrysler, doesn't really fix them, just bails them out. Meanwhile, Ford had self-fixed everything, and they got zero out of the deal. I mean, not a penny out of that deal. They didn't want any. You're exactly right. But more important than that, they didn't need any because they had made all those hard decisions years earlier. That's sometimes the regulator, she goes into this in some degree. She talks about the difference being a regulator and being a market maker. She leaves, and I would be wrong not to say this. You read this book, you will be sure that Tim Geithner, the Treasury Secretary, is not on her Christmas card list. Okay? She vilifies the guy, and I will tell you, every ounce of criticism of the Treasury Secretary is absolutely well-deserved and spot on. I got to be perfectly honest with you, the last 4 years, I'm just surprised that we're at least in as good a shape as we are. This guy, she's right. Read the book, because every story there, you have to believe it. The double dealing, the backstabbing, questions about what logic was being utilized when making these policy decisions. Every one of them, I think, the fact that she focused her criticism on Geithner, she's been criticized for that in some of the reviews. I think she's absolutely spot on with each and every one of them. Each and every one of them. Sir, I'll get to you in the back.
Paulson to be equal.
Well, it's interesting, and you mentioned Hank Paulson, kind of the architect of a lot of this stuff. I think she reserved some of her criticism on Paulson, not because she was doing him a favor. He's the previous Treasury Secretary. He's the last secretary in the Bush administration. I think he was there maybe 18 months. But he was also not there with her. Their time did not overlap by an awful lot. I think about 18 months, because she came onto the FDIC in 06, I believe. But the guts of this thing, number one, when Paulson was there, it was Paulson and Greenspan and Geithner as the head of the New York Fed, really calling the shots. There are more than a few people who believe that this wasn't just about Lehman Brothers or protecting J.P. Morgan. This is about protecting Goldman Sachs, okay? And the AIG deal, I am absolutely confident of it right now, today, that AIG was given a bailout to fix Goldman Sachs, not to fix AIG. The single largest counterparty to AIG was Goldman Sachs. They brought in a guy by the name of Ed Liddy, used to run Allstate. I know Ed. Ed was he was on the board of Goldman Sachs. There's a reason why Ed Liddy is in the personal lines insurance space his entire career in Allstate. Allstate does homeowners and car insurance, not sophisticated transactions the way AIG did around the globe. Why this guy in this company now? It was to protect Goldman Sachs. And I think a lot of people have commented on this, have written about this. As the single largest counterparty to AIG, Goldman Sachs could not afford one of two things to happen. One, AIG go down and be put into the hands of the insurance regulators. Because if the insurance regulators got their hands on AIG, we wouldn't care about Goldman Sachs. We would care about the insurance policyholders. And we wouldn't care about the financial products division in London. We would care about the insurance policyholder. That's what we would care about. So they couldn't put it in our hands. They also couldn't let AIG go down, or AIG cancel the insurance contracts that they had written on all those collateralized debt obligations on those other the mortgage-backed securities, the RMBSs, the residential mortgage-backed securities, and the commercial mortgage-backed securities. AIG and other insurance companies wrote insurance on all of those things. When the roof started to cave in, the insurance companies, a number of them said, you know what, we're going to cancel the insurance. Here's all your money back and some extra money for your trouble. We're not covering these because you did not tell us what these things really were. And a lot of insurance companies got out. If AIG had canceled their insurance on Goldman Sachs, the roof would have caved in on Goldman Sachs. That's how this thing would have gone down. And so they couldn't do that. I'll tell you a quick AIG story, then I'll go to the gentleman in the back. AIG, I'm in my office one day. I'm trying to remember if I was in New York or Albany. All I know is that my blood pressure went up to about 300 over 200. Because I get a call. I get a call from the head of AIG. He goes, just a little background. The European Union, having their own problems, had a rule that said, we don't want to deal with all these different insurance regulators, all these different banking regulators. Give us one regulator in the United States, that he called it a consolidated supervisor, and that the European Union would work with one person, whoever that person might be. So I get a call from the head of AIG. And he goes, we've picked as our consolidated supervisor the Office of Thrift Supervision. I said, you're kidding me, of course. He goes, no, we're going to use the OTS. The OTS, well known, and those of you who follow this stuff know how weak the OTS really was. The OTS is really ground zero of the recession, because those guys didn't have a clue what was going on and cared even less about getting a clue or enforcing the rules that they had. And so they tell me on the phone that they're going to go to us and use as their consolidated supervisor the weakest link in the chain. I was mortified. I said, well, yeah, that's exactly why you picked them. So I said, what about the New York Insurance Department? No, I have banking interests, is what the quote I got. I have banking interests. Okay, what about the banking department? What about the Federal Reserve? What about the Office of the Controller of the Currency? You have dozens to pick from. Why not them? Nope. I wanted the weakest guy around. And the OTS, by every definition, and you'll read about it here too, the OTS was the weak sister in the entire system. And so what happened is we have this rather strenuous argument to no avail, but I'm like, and there's nothing I could do about it. Not the New York Department, not the Pennsylvania Insurance Department, the regular and routine regulators of this company are suddenly no longer in the driver's seat. AIG Financial Planning in London is what got this company into trouble. Not anything on their insurance portfolio. Financial planning, financial products got them into trouble. And we did not have access to that because he had picked another regulator to be his consolidated supervisor. Let me go here first, and I'll go to you. Go ahead.
My question was about AIG. You mentioned the insurance industry didn't have anything, so AIG was...
The AIG exposure was all on their financial product side. Their core insurance business, insuring this building if they had it, or D&O insurance or whatever kind of insurance, was not their issue. They are a sound and were a sound and always have been a sound insurance company. But it's the way they package and repackage and then put insurance layers over these financial products that got them into trouble. And it was all run out of a largely unregulated operation in London, not here in New York. And we looked at the AIG org chart. There were something like 800 distinct corporate entities under the AIG umbrella. 800. And the thing is, to have one entity create all this trouble for an organization with 800 separate entities is really a magnificent notion. Now, I'll give you one postscript. While I disagreed with the CEO of AIG on his decision to go with the OTS and strenuously disagreed with him, one of the interesting things that happened between that day and the financial crisis was that the CEO was removed on a totally unrelated issue. Hank Greenberg was his name. He's still around in the insurance business, but he was removed by Spitzer when he was the Attorney General. And on a totally unrelated matter, if Hank Greenberg was in AIG, this would have gone down differently. And I don't think you would have had nearly the amount of federal involvement in AIG that you ended up having. Because what ended up happening, after the feds got involved, he sued AIG because he wanted some of his value back, because he was the single largest stockholder of AIG and lost a fortune on the federal government's management of AIG. If he was still in office, and you can't see all these things coming, if he was still in office, AIG, the whole thing would not have gone down the same way. Go to the back first. Sorry.
There must be 1,000 questions, but I'll just ask the first one that comes to my mind. how do you bundle and sell debt?
Well, we'll come back and do a securitization seminar in the future, but I won't sell you on it. So it's.
They bundled and sold debt.
And on top of that, it wasn't considered an insurance product. In fact, the Congress deliberately made it so that it wasn't an insurance product so that we couldn't regulate it. The derivatives, the swaps, the insurance regulators were not in charge of that issue.
And then they shorted themselves. They bet against themselves.
And it's interesting you mention that because not only were they betting against themselves, but there's a common notion in investment, arbitrage. You're working one side off of against the other, right? Okay. One of the things she talks about in this book that I think most people in the public don't know about is this notion called regulatory arbitrage. And that's exactly what AIG had done with me. When they said that they weren't going to use the New York department as their consolidated supervisor, they were exercising regulatory arbitrage by going to OTS, thinking that OTS was going to do a lot better for them than I could, because I would be asking questions and doing the exams and having our people in AIG. He exercised regulatory arbitrage, and it's something that goes on all the time, and most people in the public know nothing about it. But she talks about it, and it's fascinating stuff, and it's something that people need to know much more about. Sir?
Wasn't the AIG bailout about $180 billion, which was 4 times bigger than the General Motors bailout, or the Morgan Stanley, or the JP Morgan, or the Goldman Sachs? This number was 4 times anybody else's.
Well, if you combine Goldman Sachs with AIG, you can't think of Goldman Sachs and AIG not together. So the 180 billion you split between AIG and Goldman for the obvious reasons. By the way, you remember Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary, was a former CEO, a co-CEO of Goldman Sachs, but we all know that. She goes to great lengths. She goes to great length talking about the bailouts, talking about the efficacy of the bailouts, not only just on the resolution side, but on this notion of there didn't a reason to these bailouts. That it's just money. Just could put as much money in as is needed, and without really understanding, what's happening. Now, put this in perspective. After Hurricane Irene up here last year, okay, the FEMA came in, and if you want to call it a bailout, bailed a lot of people out by paying for their homes. But what did they do? They didn't just bail them out. They said, you're no longer going to live on this property because it's too close to this Schoharie Creek, right? They said, you're moving. They didn't do that with the companies. They gave them the money, but didn't go after them and say, you're now going to fix the way you do things. GM is doing some of the very same things that got them into trouble today. And that's the point of her epilogue, is that she talks about this. Her frustration is that she sees so much of the same stuff happening all over again, whether it's subprime lending. Absolutely opposed to this notion of having people who have been foreclosed on get second and third chances. Not because she doesn't like people, but because we're making the same mistake over and over again and just exacerbating the impact of it. That's her concern with it, is that it's not, she is truly a Main Streeter, but Main Street can't keep paying for all this stuff as we continue to make the same mistake over and over again. Sir?
Just in case you feel that the banking and the insurance companies get it all in the neck, some of the oversight of construction and development and zoning has the same arguments, and a lot of folks get bailed out for lower standards only to look for recovery after damage.
Well, it happens in every industry, and every regulated industry. You have to ask yourself a first question. Why are you regulated? You're regulated because you either have, there's a safety issue, and safety, what I mean by that is not just a building falling down or burning down, but in the financial parlance, we call it financial safety and soundness. That's the language. Prudential safety and soundness is the term used in regulation, in financial regulation. And there's a reason for that. And the regulators can't forget that that's part of their mission. They can't forget that having adequate resources. When I was the first deputy superintendent, I had a super who was wonderful, an outstanding public servant, but who came from Goldman Sachs. And he raised the question more than once. Why aren't we accounting on a GAAP basis for insurance companies? Insurance companies operate under something what they call statutory accounting, and it's much more conservative than GAAP accounting. But this is a guy from Wall Street. This is a guy who's working with regular companies all day long. Why are insurance companies different? Aren't we holding them back? And we would argue, and I and the rest of the staff argued successfully, because he got off that notion of changing the accounting of insurance companies, because we said, because we're not like everybody else. Insurance company, if you don't have that insurance commitment at the end of the day, then we have nothing to look towards, because that's the whole premise of the value proposition. You're buying an insurance policy, not so that they'll accept your premium check, because they'll do that willingly. You're doing it so that they're there when something bad happens to you. And so you have to be more conservative about this. Even Hank Greenberg has said it's lunacy that publicly traded insurance companies have to live by quarterly results, because you can't feed both masters. And she talks about that to some degree in this book. Our job is to protect. Just like our job is to protect you from the street thug, our job is to protect you both from the guy who thinks he's doing right but is doing wrong, the guy who is actually trying to do wrong, and the guy who is in between the two of them, thinks he's doing it right, and then ends up doing it wrong. And that's what we're there to protect them from. Now, people come in and they have arguments, and we talk to a lot of people, and sometimes their arguments make sense. So what you do is you say, okay, you know what? I don't need you to keep all that money in a bank, non-performing capital. So you go out and you get a letter of credit from a AAA-rated company, and that will suffice, but the money, the value proposition is still intact. What Sheila talks about in the book basically is breaking apart of the value proposition, what we all signed on for when we have these financial regulators. Whether it's subprime lending or the bailouts or anything in between, what did we as the public sign on for? And we sign on for the idea that the value proposition will remain intact, that we will be protected at the end of the day. And that's why it was relatively easy to work with her during 9/11. But as I read the book, none of this surprised me as being her perspective, because she has never lost that. She's never lost those Kansas roots in terms of what it was that drove her boss, Bob Dole, over those many years, and drove her during her time as chair of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. More so than anybody else, if you can't secure the depositor of a bank, you might as well go back to 1929. That's the lesson that was learned in 1929. And whether it's insurance or banking, the fact is that you can't let your guard down when it comes to that. And what her argument is that we let our guard down by letting them take too much capital out of the marketplace. The only thing I would say with the book is that she spends a little too much time defending the FDIC in and of itself. Now, I will tell you, I will defend the Department of Financial Services and the work that those people did when I was there 1,000%. But the only problem is that she does it like in chapter 2. Actually, chapter 1, she gives you this great prologue. She really draws you in with her prologue. And then it's like hitting a brick wall. She's talking about the bureaucracy of the FDIC. I understand it was important for the rest of the book because she talked about how the staff did a lot to protect the public. But I don't think she needed to go into that level of detail in chapter 1 because it slowed the book down. You're ready to go. You read that prologue, you're ready to go. And suddenly she's talking about bureaucratic setups inside the FDIC. It was a little slow. The good part about the book is that she breaks it out into different issues. You don't have to read the book serially. You want to read about GM, you go to the chapter on GM. You want to read the book about Wachovia, you go to the chapter on Wachovia. And that's, so you can read this book. In fact, I did not read the book cover to cover in one sitting, you know, from front to back. I bounced around this book quite a bit. I got lots of dog ears, got lots of underlining, I got a ton of notes in the back of it, but I bounced around depending upon if my mood was I wanted to read about the bailouts or I wanted to read about subprime lending or something in between. And so it's good that way. You can read this book in one sitting, or you can, straight through, or you can come back to it depending upon what your interest is. You'll get your MBA by reading this book. You'll get your crime novels and satisfaction out of this book, and you'll get everything in between of that. So thank you very much. Appreciate your questions.